Michael Goldberg. I'm an executive director of our Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship here alongside my colleague, Doug DiGirolamo. I'm also a professor at our Weatherhead School of Management, and it's great to welcome back to campus in our Zoom world, Jeff Wilcox, who's a graduate, engineering graduate undergrad here. And Jeff and I met through Al's introduction, which is great. And Jeff, we're thrilled to welcome you to our alumni speaker series.
Thank you.
All of our sessions are moderated by students, and we're thrilled that Himika Kalra is our moderator today. She is she did her undergrad here and also is currently in our master's in accountancy program and heading to Deloitte next year. Was also worked this summer for one of our alumni startups called Apartment List this summer as part of our remote entrepreneurship project program, which was a lot of fun. For those watching on LinkedIn, we're streaming on LinkedIn Live. Just if you have any questions that you want to put for Jeff, just let us know, and Doug and I will be monitoring, and we'll make sure that Himika gets the message. And for those that are on Zoom, we want this to be interactive, as you can tell, because I've already called on all of you. So just let Himika know what questions you have. You can either put a question in the chat, raise your real hand, raise your Zoom hand, but we want to have this be as interactive as possible. So with that, let me turn it over to Himika. And Jeff, thank you again for making the time.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. As Professor Goldberg mentioned, my name is Himika Kalra, and I will be helping moderating the conversation today. I wanted to keep it a little bit casual. And first, Jeff, if you don't mind telling us a little bit more about yourself, your background, and what you currently do, and how this all plays into digital transformation.
Yeah, wow, thank you. First, thanks for having me. It's been fun to reconnect with Case. I don't think I've been on campus. I graduated in '86, so it's been since the late '80s that I've actually set foot on campus. So I hope to visit in person sometime soon. It's interesting that the folks, when they introduced themselves on the Zoom call, were talking about digital transformation and how important it is, and it is a huge topic, and so happy to address it. But what I've kind of come around to is, it reminds me of my master's thesis, which ended up, it was a nonlinear programming optimization problem. And it started out with pages and pages of equations and just a lot of detail and a lot of work. And I thought, okay, good, this is a master's thesis. And over time, I found simplifications and shortcuts and different ways to look at things. And so by the time I was ready to graduate, this was from Drexel, it all fit on one page, and I panicked. I'm like, how can a master's thesis possibly fit on one page? Is there anything here, there, or not? And I took it to my advisor, and he said, Jeff, what you either found here is something either profound or trivial, and I don't know which also sort of sent me into a tizzy. And that's a little bit how I feel about digital transformation, which is, and I'll tell you my sort of career story, but to me, it built up from really detailed technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning, generative design, all that, which was all about technology. And then from there, it kind of went into, oh, wait, this is really about the IT backbone and the foundation that connects all that technology. And then I said, oh, wait, no, it's not. It's really about the practices that we employ so that we can best take advantage of those digital technologies. And then about 6 to 12 months ago, I said, oh, wait, no, it's not. It's about people, and it's about unleashing the power of using technology to unleash the power of people and working differently. All that's by way of saying, I don't know exactly what it is. And I was the founding vice president for digital transformation at Lockheed Martin. So happy to tease that in any direction. A little bit about my career. I did graduate from Case in '86. I didn't set out to be an engineer. I joined pre-med. I joined as a biology major. And ended up, I was living on, I don't know what the campus is like now, but at the time, the dorms on the south side were, I was in Tippett 240, were 6 individual rooms around a suite, and my 5 roommates were all engineers. And you may have heard psychologists talk about the fact that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. That's a little bit, I think that's very true. So for me, surrounded by engineers, I just said, okay, I like them, I like the classes. I think I'll become an engineer. And getting out, still doing that in 4 years, having started pre-med, meant biomedical engineering, was my undergraduate major. When I went to Drexel, I ended up in the electrical engineering department after a little bit of time. Largely, again, just circumstance. I was walking down the hallway, didn't have much money. Everything I owned in my Ford Escort parked on the street, and saw a flyer asking for someone to apply for a research assistantship with the professor. And I went in, and luckily I had from my summer job a letter of recommendation because my grades did not speak for themselves leaving Case. And that was positive. And so ended up with an RA, ended up getting into electrical engineering, got my master's from Drexel in '88. And been in Washington ever since. I started out working on radar systems. My master's thesis was in, I mentioned design, it was in optimization theory, basically, but had to do with antenna design and how you design an antenna to best work in a communication system or a radar system. So I went to work for a small radar company. And then after 2 years, went to work for SAIC, which is where Al and I met. We both share that common pedigree. And ended up, I'm an introvert, and I always thought my life would be professional life in a cube, looking at a computer, doing what became programming or just solving problems. And it started out that way. Again, I remember working triple integrals on paper before you really had the kind of computing power that lets you simulate that, and studying how radio waves interacted with ocean waves. That's what my work was. And so I did that, and then we ended up finding something sort of profound, an effect that we saw, and all this was in a classified environment, so to this day can't speak a lot about it. But there was a certain type of phenomenology which was very important to our customer, if true, but we don't know if it was true. So I ended up proposing a test. I remember the day I gave the briefing to the customer saying, if you let me go do this experiment, we can decide if this is true. I'm not sure what my thought process was, but I ended up proposing Hawaii. So I'm guessing my thought process was I honeymooned there and I loved Hawaii, so let's go do this test in Hawaii. There was actually a bit more to it. It turns out the west coast of Kauai has a Navy base and a cliff and a steep drop off. And Hawaii is one of the few places that were sort of accessible, which have really deep ocean. And so you can generate the kind of waves that you need to do the study. You can't do it off the East Coast, too shallow and so forth. So did that. And that was sort of the first fork in the road for me career-wise. It was when I realized, well, I like technology. I'm not the world's best technologist, but I loved pulling people together. I had a team of like 10 people, had a subcontractor, 2 subcontractors, one building electronics, one building this buoy. Just so exciting to pull it all together and then to pull it off and to find out that the numbers really were true was, to this day, one of sort of the top 3, I'll say, accomplishments I think back on in my career. But that set me on a course of management. So I ended up successively leading larger and larger programs. And then eventually, just like you can't tell technology from program management after a while, when it's big enough, you can't tell program management from business management. So I ended up basically in business management of a large technology operation at SAIC. Long story there behind, after 17 years, decided to leave SAIC and took a job as vice president of initially software engineering at Lockheed Martin. And that was in 2007. And then over time, became vice president for engineering for the company. And then we ended up merging engineering and manufacturing. So I became the VP for both operations and design/engineering. And that's another important fork in the road in my career, because as an engineer, I had a sort of a hubris and a bias, which was design was where all the magic happened, and manufacturing was just where they did what you told them to do. It was sort of where my brain space was at the time. But when my job was to be involved with the folks on the factory floor and those that led them, the most common complaint I heard was, we have so much more innovation capacity in our factories than our engineers are designing for. If only they knew that, and if only we could connect digitally to them and holistically do design and manufacturing, and then later sustainment, field service, we could just create so much more value for our customer and solve problems so much more effectively. So that led, and I will wrap this up shortly, to, like I mentioned, once you start looking at that, you're looking at what they call operations technologies or digital technologies. You may have heard the term the fourth industrial revolution or industry 4.0, which again is this suite of augmented reality, virtual reality, generative design, machine learning, factory robotics, transformational computing, the whole suite of what we think of as the technology that's driving things today. So I put that portfolio together. And then again, you start to realize, okay, it's not about those technologies. It's about integrating that with the IT foundation. And that's when I worked with our leadership to create this vice president for digital transformation role, and ended up through a series of executive briefings. Again, a really formative time in my career. This is just going back 3 years now, but briefing in the boardroom is its whole other experience. And how do you sell to the 10 top people in the company this idea for this huge transformation program. So I did that, and then decided for a number of reasons. I like teaching. I'm an adjunct professor now at two schools, at Georgetown and at Miami of Ohio, where my boys go to college. So long story short, decided, okay, that was hard. I need to take a breath. I want to do some teaching. I want to spend some time with my family. So I went half-time starting in January. So I'm now half retired, which ultimately gets me to Hemika's question, which is what's my current job? And now I'm the vice president for Digital Futures. I worked with our executive team to create a job that could be done half-time, that didn't have day-to-day responsibilities. And so my job is kind of in two pieces. I have the Vision 2030, which is asking, okay, a lot of change going on, right? What does the future look like? And nobody knows, but you can do sketches and propose ideas and say, maybe it'll be like this, maybe we'll work like this, maybe we'll use these tools, maybe we'll hire from different types of schools, whatever. And then you can do experiments. So we have this sort of agile cycle of casting a vision for the future, making hypotheses, and then running little experiments. I'll just give you one minor sort of example. If you believed in 2030, instead of being on Zoom, we'll all be holograms and we'll all be together virtually as holograms. Maybe true, maybe not. If so, well, let's buy two systems, put one in two different cities and try it out and see how it works, and then talk about it. It's just an example of the kind of loops that we do. Apologies for rambling and taking up most of our hour with my 30-year journey, but yeah, that's my story.
That was really interesting. Thank you for giving us an overview. I actually do have a really good question that came in the chat. So Igor, would you like to ask the question?
Sure, happy to. Hi, Jeff. I'm a case student in the master's program and an entrepreneur. And I was curious as to what you think of the innovator's dilemma and how you really balance strong innovation with what your customers are willing to adopt.
Yeah, that's sort of been the question of my career. I actually had the honor of working with Clay Christensen. He came and spoke with us as a consultant. We lost recently, passed away. But Clay, if you don't know, he wrote the book and sort of was the Harvard professor who talked about this innovator's dilemma. Nobody's solved that, right? And it's about just sort of constantly finding a balance between risk and trying new things. There's a lot of different models where you set up entrepreneurial cells. Like if you think of a Lockheed Martin, you might know the history of the Skunk Works, which is started in Burbank, now in Southern California, and made some of the most iconic aircraft ever, known as one of the great innovation cells of all time. That was done in large part, if you read Kelly Johnson's rules, he was the founder of it, it's about separating it, right? And not burdening it with too much process and keeping it small and lean. So there are models that let you work with the innovator's dilemma to protect. You have to protect a cell, a think cell and an experimentation cell somewhere, hopefully multiple places in the organization, because big companies are built to routinize tasks and deliver products reliably, right? And so our customers count on that. So you have to balance that and that execution focus by having a separate activity, which is going to be, not that there's not innovation in how you do something you've done 3,000 of already, but that's incremental. You need a separate cell where you're doing those kind of studies, like a Skunk Works. But yeah, been around that problem for 20 or 30 years, never found a good answer. Take it day by day.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
So I had a question following what you said earlier about, when you're thinking about digital transformation through all the different years, the recent focus has been a lot more on people. Do you mind expanding a little bit more about how you came to that and what you've learned from the last few years?
Yeah, thank you. I have this theory based on no data, just based on living and working for 30 years and watching people. And there are also studies where you ask people, how productive do you feel at work? How engaged do you feel at work across any industry? And you get pretty sad numbers. People say, well, I feel like I can give 30% of myself, to work because the rest it's just not, productive time. And anybody that's worked, I never worked in a small company, but certainly in big companies, the culture often has a lot of constraints, and the way we meet and the way we make decisions and the way we do strategy and the way we basically share information in the company. So what became clear out of digital transformation was the shift to this fourth industrial revolution is the shift to treating data as the strategic asset. It's not the product stream itself. It's not like going from here to here to here, and it's not the financials, it's the data. And there's a lot behind that, like digital tapestries and virtual design and so forth. But once you shift to data being the core value creator for the company, then the question becomes, how do you share that data? And how do you unlock the potential of that data? And that's all about people. That's all about transparency. You know, how do you make sure people know what they need to be fully engaged? And I can talk more about the practices we use to do that kind of thing. How do you make sure management has the visibility to make the right decisions, whether they're investing in a new factory or changing a policy? How do you become a data-driven company? And you do that by changing how people exchange information and turn it into value. So I'm saying this poorly, but people have phenomenal capacity, and too often we don't put them in a situation where they can unleash it. And I think that's our responsibility as leaders, is to unlock that potential. And I think that's what digital transformation can do, done right. Too often, if you just Google it, you're going to read about technologies. So I don't know if that made any sense, Hanneke.
No, it definitely did. And I know when we were talking about this, one of the questions I had was, with this initiative in mind, how has the transition been in the last few months from going from working in person to work from home? How has the engagement been within the teams you've worked with, and any strategies you might have for people in the room to carry forward?
Yeah, it's been, so I'll just speak to my particular team. There's a broader conversation about factories and so forth and COVID and return to work. But I'll just talk about the transformation effort. For us, it was, I hate to say seamless, because that's not, because our lives have all had a wrench thrown in them, so it's not been seamless. But the nature of what we were doing starting about a year and a half ago was new practices and tools to enable, again, all about people and sharing information. And you have to get away from the water cooler and the conference room for sharing information. And so we did that before COVID. Our team was entirely virtual. And even if people were in the building, we would meet virtually. You would still, go in to Zoom or whatever and meet virtually. The challenge became several challenges, but one is there's an aspect of work and working effectively and sharing information which is personal, a large aspect. And when you lose that kind of water cooler conversation or just casual talking about your weekend, you lose a lot of value. And so we had to change our practices to do things like we have what we call a check-in round. We start every meeting with a check-in round, and it's always a question, usually a silly one. If you could have any kind of cake for your birthday, what would it be? Or one of my favorites is, okay, we're going to take our meeting to the zoo today, but we only have time to see one animal, so what animal will we see? And we go around and everybody answers. There's also science that shows if people speak up early in the meeting, they're more likely to speak up later. And we also have techniques if the meeting gets big. If you have 100 people, then use the chat window, things like that. So the other thing was basically mandating video. There is, again, science showing how much more information is conveyed in video than just audio. And so everybody turns their cameras on in our meeting, and it makes a huge difference to everybody. It's interesting, I've been coming alongside my kids who are remote learning. So I sit in their classes sometimes. I sit in my son's calc class and my other son's trigonometry class. Very few of the kids turn their cameras on, and I get that. A lot of times you haven't showered yet, or you just want to, not be seen. But it's hard for the teacher. It's hard for anybody trying to share information when you're just looking at black boxes, on the screen. So video was huge. Things like check-in rounds were huge. We also used, we went to Box for our collaborative documents. And so I find if you work in a meeting, people are much more engaged if instead of sort of going around and talking, we'll put questions up on a box note and share the screen. And people will type right in to those their ideas. So even if you don't, speak up or get your 2 cents in, it shows up there in the box note. And then every meeting has a moderator, facilitator that can pull things out. And the effect of that, and we have other things we've done too, but is everybody contributes. I spoke about the power of people. In large companies, it's easy for hierarchy to determine who speaks the most. It's a default mode. But when you use these other practices and tools, what happens is everybody contributes. So I remember a meeting, last year where we literally had our summer intern and our senior vice president in the room contributing equally, different types of ideas. So it's all about the power of diversity and diverse opinions and thoughts and bringing people together. So to come back around to your question, on the one hand, everybody's life had a wrench thrown into it, and you never want to minimize what. The other thing is to recognize what people are going through at home and may or may not be going through at home. Who's got kids they're trying to deal with outside their bedroom door? Who's got an elder parent? And my mom's in a nursing home, worrying about that. You have to respect that and create space for that and space to, in a sense, grieve. What's been lost from normalcy. So the line definitely shifted between work is all about work and home is all about home to this interesting middle space where I think it's incredibly powerful, again, to help people contribute to the fullness of their potential. But it's also risk areas, people want privacy. Do you want someone, to know certain things about you? So at this point, I've talked so long, I've forgotten your question, but it's been different, but not a fundamental 90-degree turn because of the practices that we put in place through our transformation efforts already.
That was perfect. That was really interesting to hear. I've had a few questions come in the chat. The
Great.
first one is, could you expand on the role of AI in digital transformation?
I can phrase that. That one came from me, so I want to phrase that a little bit more. What spurred me, Jeff, was that when you were talking about data and the power of being data, which is a really interesting viewpoint, and then now you want to unlock it, and then people who have all this capacity can solve it, and so now you introduce AI, which can also do that. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. That's one, and then a totally separate topic, and I hate to hit it. I'm trying to confuse you, Jeff.
Thanks.
But
It's not hard. It's a low bar.
The second one was, this group, a lot of the focus of Veale has been around entrepreneurship and newcos and sort of stuff like that. And I think one of the areas that often gets, I don't want to say overlooked, but I would say sort of sidetracked is conversations that you and I have had over the last year around the role of large corporations, which that is now the fad of venture. And if you have a minute, I would like to hear about your thoughts, which again, you and I have talked about, of the pluses and minuses of those involved. So those are two very different questions, but I'm just putting those out and I'll go back on mute. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah,
AI is such a broad question. How to approach that? I'm a bit of an iconoclast in that I don't like the term at all. I always want to split hairs when I answer that question. So clearly, those suite of technologies, those optimization technologies and learning algorithms. I was doing neural networks in the late 80s, so this stuff is not new. Those papers go back to the 60s and 70s. Has been huge in sort of the biggest payoff for us that I've seen has really been, again, in operations, and it's been in being able to see data pop up like supplier problems or machines that are having issues on the factory floor. So sort of that first tier of AI, which is really just focus of attention. It says something's going on here, take a look at this. And that's a helpful screening. I think the coolest application I've seen is generative design, which is using AI as the engine for doing design of products. And if you think about how we've done design since Da Vinci or since the wheel, I don't know, going way back, you had to visualize something and then you would design it. You have an airplane, I think it should look like this and have a wing and a propeller and whatnot. And then you do what engineers call guess and check, which is, okay, let me try this wing, let me test it, let me try this one. I'm overstating that a little bit, but it still starts with us assuming something about what it's going to look like. Well, computers don't do that, right? If you have a generative design, all you care about is how it's going to perform. And so, and there's some great examples online. There's one Autodesk has, they did with Airbus on using AI to design a new bulkhead, which they then 3D printed. You can see if you just lose the assumption about what something should look like, which is what AI does for you, and just focus on optimizing the outcome, you see totally different types of products, brackets, and we have 3D printed or generative design, based brackets in space, flying in space. So I don't know, I could go anywhere with that question because we use it everywhere, really big in the field. A lot of it's what I call focus of attention, but I guess I would summarize all that by saying, if you think of it as its own animal, as opposed to a tool, which I see a lot of people doing, I think you end up kind of going down the wrong road. And the other sort of question about, I guess, big companies and small companies, we're a system integrator. A large fraction of our revenue comes from working with small businesses and other larger businesses. And so our job is to find the best of breed for our customers. So if you're making an aircraft, we don't make a whole aircraft, right? You buy landing gear somewhere, you buy engines somewhere, so forth. And you do that whole science of system integration. So the challenge is to create an innovation ecosystem. There's benefit to both, right? There's tremendous benefit to size and scale, and depth and breadth. We have 100,000 people. And then there's tremendous benefits to two people in a garage, that are thinking of things, a little bit like the AI example, that they don't have a preconceived notion of what something should look like. So, that's a challenge, and you and I have talked about this, Al, that I think needs to be cracked. How do you, as a big company, really embrace that innovation ecosystem and have the right impedance match to those smaller entrepreneurial companies? I think whoever figures that out most effectively will have a huge discriminator in their landscape. So I don't know if that was anywhere near your question.
So we have a question coming in from Shruti. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask it?
Yes, thank you. So I was wondering, you mentioned Clayton Christensen, and then I was reminded of another great, Henry Chesbrough, who spoke so vocally about open innovation and how we should adopt open innovation to try and increase the innovative output. Do we really think we've used open innovation enough? Are people free enough to do this, or do you think we should be really concentrating on this more?
I think we should concentrate on that more. I've seen some great examples of it working. Like GE did, I think they're in Ohio, did an open innovation challenge for designing a product. I forget what it was, a widget of some sort. And whenever people run innovation competitions, the winners, quote unquote, are always from places you would not expect them to be from. It's again, just the power of thinking differently. The challenges end up being, sort of the obvious ones, right? Intellectual property and licensing, and who's going to get credit for that and who's going to make the money from that.
Yeah, so I find that really interesting that 50 years after putting a man on the moon, we still haven't figured out how we can do this constructively, because you spoke about the power of people, and I give a talk quite often about the power of partnerships.
Yeah.
And whenever there's been a partnership, it has just been so, logarithmically more productive than not having it. And I just wondered whether the great minds can't get together and work out a way where, of course, IP is important, and the freedom to operate, etc. But if there is a way to not get around it, but work with it.
Yeah, there have been some strikes there. I like the way you phrased that. In my current job, I didn't break it down, but we look at 2030 in three spaces. One is people, one is places where you work, and the other is partners, who you work with. And I did it that way because I think you're right. That if you look throughout history, look at what happened, during World War II between academia like MIT and between the Army/Air Force, and between industry, and how that led to the birth of that whole capability. Partnerships are just really powerful. We're trying to look at examples like the one I just mentioned where we've gotten it right. There are some, I don't know if anyone on the call is familiar with the Manufacturing USA Institutes. I know Al is, but these are public-private partnerships that Lockheed Martin was out in front of. We joined the first 8 of them. I was on Congress talking about the importance of this, making them statutory a couple of years ago. So those are where small companies and academia and industry. There's one in Ohio that America Makes. It's in Youngstown. One in Detroit, one in Pittsburgh, and so forth. So I think those are some small success stories where they have dealt with the IP issues, they've dealt with licensing issues, they've dealt with using pre-competitive approaches. Yeah, you'd think big minds could figure this out.
we hosted an America Make Fellow in the UK last year, which was quite novel for us because we don't have a United Kingdom Make Fellow, but the America Makes Fellow we hosted Roger Narayan from who was in the sort of additive manufacturing space, and he came and spoke to us. Yeah. And there's certainly a huge amount to learn from that.
Yeah, I think in general in my studies, Europe in particular has done better at this than the US has. Like there seems to be more of a, I want to say, kind of more of a go it alone to spirit. MIT did a report called Production in the Innovation Economy, which we contributed to. And they said America's got sort of this, everyone, more of a go it alone and everybody should succeed or fail on their own. Europe, in terms of how like the large companies deal with, engage with smaller companies is different. And I think there's a lot we could learn here. I toured the Audi plant in Ingolstadt in Germany a few years back, and their suppliers are in their park. And there's just constant feedback between them and their suppliers in design. So lots of room for improvement. Yeah, but thanks for that question, because figuring that out is going to be really, really important. And for whatever reason, we're not there yet.
I would say also, Jeff, that universities, that's sort of how it works in many ways. I mean, not between universities, but certainly in a university. I mean, in many ways, the collaboration model and interdisciplinary model has really accelerated and has shown great successes. And so, I think that's one of the things that the industry can learn. And I think that's one of the great reasons why you want to have the higher ed, corporation partnerships, because it's again, at higher ed, partnerships is the way, interdisciplinary work is the way it goes.
Yeah, and that's a whole other conversation we don't have time for. And again, you and I kind of had about, which is about the relationship between, part of our partners look at 2030 is the relationship between industry and academia, because it could be a lot better. It tends to be kind of transactional, whether it's hiring or whether it's research grants, instead of creating shared value. There's a lot of room for improvement there, and it's so important. And again, you look at history, there's been some great examples of when that's gone right and how much value it's created. But a little bit, I worry the two have drifted apart, industry and academia, over the last many decades. Sort of different incentive structures, if you will. That it'd be nice to keep bringing those back together again. And these public-private partnerships have been a great mechanism for that.
The question that I have is, do you think there's room for innovation in every company? And just another one that came in was, do you think this is going to become an industry or global norm for larger companies to become R&D wheelhouses?
So can innovation happen anywhere? I can't think of an example where it can't, but innovation flourishes when leadership lets it flourish. So if you find yourself in a company where leadership is not letting it flourish, then it's not a healthy place to be. So yeah, I can't think of a case where it can't happen. Individuals can always innovate, in small groups inside of companies, often even outside of the 9 to 5 responsibilities that they may have. There's lots of examples of that. I think the 3M Post-it note story was done by somebody on his own time, was looking to make his choir director making his sheet music stick to the stand, and so found this glue that would let the sheet music stick to the music stand. That was on Sundays, right? Lots of examples. And there's companies, again, like 3M, I don't know if they still do this, I think Google does too, that actually set aside time for employees, a certain percentage of your time to think differently and big thoughts and try stuff. So yeah, I'd like to think that it can happen anywhere. But again, it's about leadership, creating the space for it to happen. I forgot the second question you said there, Himika.
The second question was, do you think this is going to become an industry or global norm for larger companies to become R&D wheelhouses?
I don't know the answer to that. I think every case is going to be a bit different. If you go back in time, like the big companies were the R&D wheelhouses because they had large R&D investments. You think of Bell Labs, for example, and what came out of Bell Labs. Lots of great stories about big companies that, they used to have libraries. This is back when that sort of mattered. You can get anything you need now on the internet, but So, and then you saw a trend over the 80s and 90s with a lot of sort of value extraction going on, where it wasn't, if it didn't contribute to short-term earnings, it wasn't funded. And so I think, and again, MIT's done a lot of good studies on this particular topic. There was a decrease in innovation capacity in large companies for that reason. And now I think you've started to see it build up again out of a recognition that there's something to be said for scale and for having a lot of different minds together. Like I said, 100,000 people in our case, and now having the tools to actually have those minds work on the same problems at the same time, or contribute in ways you couldn't before the digital revolution, where you were just in a different office in a different part of the country. So I believe digital transformation really can favor large R&D companies, and it can be an innovation wheelhouse. And again, to come back to where I started, done right, done unleashing the power of people and not being overly prescriptive with it. But I think technology has caused that pendulum to swing all the way back to where, or swinging back to where that scale is a positive discriminator. And I do think that's a trend in large companies, done right.
That is very interesting to hear. I just wanted to let everyone know that I will be taking the final rounds of questions, so please feel free to message me in the private message with anything that you have. A question that I do have as a student, and the thing is, when you go through university experiences, you're in that same mindset of what is expected from you, what your major expects, and you graduate, and before you know it, you're in the workforce. So a lot of this conversation today has been really intriguing and really pushing students to think beyond what is in the classroom, in the projects. So what advice would you have for a student maybe either just starting their journey at school or towards the end to think in the ways that you've talked about today and, think innovatively about the future?
Yeah, thank you. That's hard. I'll start with a bit of a sort of controversial statement that won't endear me to the faculty members on the call. But in general, the thing that students are most surprised about when they join the company is how little their classroom experience resembled the work experience. There's really very little. I mean, you learn tools in school, but the classroom experience is the opposite in many ways of the work experience. And why I say that is in class, and again, I've been sitting in my kids' class and trying to help them with remote learning. It's really about, you're told what to do, you're told how to do it, and you're measured based on how closely what you did comes to what the instructor wanted you to do. Work is nothing like that. When you show up at work, and again, caveat saying my experience is limited to the companies that I've been in, but we work on large, complex, socio-technical issues and challenges. There's no one answer, there's no right answer. And often the questions aren't even posed necessarily. So, and I know when we have new hires come in, all of them, almost without exception, are sort of flummoxed by that, which is, okay, no one's telling me what to do. What's the homework? When's the next assignment? And most work their way through that over time, and that sort of works out. But so the question to your question, what can you do while in school? Obviously, you're learning skills and tools. I mentioned I got to work and was doing the triple integrals that I learned on at Case Western. So you're learning tools, and that's valuable. I would encourage you to, start to cultivate the habit, if you don't have it, of asking questions and asking challenging questions of your instructors. And by challenging, I don't mean, will this be covered on the quiz next week, which is usually what the questions seem to be. But asking why is the most important question anybody can ask, and it can be annoying, to a professor. But when I tell someone there's something at work and I would like them to work on it, nobody ever says why, but I wish they would. Like, why is that important? Based on what that you're seeing, are you asking me to look at that? So that's a fair game question, for instructors as well. Why do I have to learn quadratic curve fitting? When is that used? Just to pick the example we did this morning in my son's calculus class. So ask a lot of questions, look for, another challenge that you'll have is in school, classes are broken up and kind of separated. I know there are holistic programs where people work, jointly across schools and so forth, but in general, your classes are separate, right? But again, that's not how it works at work. One assignment is sort of always leads over into another assignment. And so look for ways to connect the dots between classes. But yeah, I guess the most, I feel like I'm not giving helpful advice. Ask a lot of questions and understand why you're learning what you're learning, understanding how it relates to other things that you're learning, and help your teachers. When I teach a class, again, as I said, at Georgetown, and my favorite moments were when students asked questions or gave examples in ways that created shared value between them and me. And I could give you examples that we don't have time for, but I want to learn from my students as much as I want them to learn from me. I want them to make us all better. I want them to make the class better. At work, I want to make the whole company better, right? I want us to work together to do that. And I want to learn from you, whether you're a summer intern or whether you're a senior vice president. So try to cultivate that attitude early in your classes, and obviously in a very professional, constructive, respectful way. I'm not saying, harass your teachers. I'm just saying recognize that you have to get outside that bubble and figure out why you're doing things and ask questions, and then draw connections between different things you've learned in different classes. So I don't know if that's of any use.
That really was. Thank you for the advice. And next I have Professor Goldberg with a question.
It's fine, Jeff. I loved actually where you were going with that question. And towards the end, because of the new hat you're wearing in front of the classroom, engaging with students, I was going to go exactly where, and maybe I'll riff off something you were saying, as you give advice to Himika and other students about how to best engage in this environment. Now that you're wearing a faculty hat and sort of sitting inside a university, how can we do a better job, particularly actually in this kind of somewhat unusual time, providing and preparing our students for sort of what's next?
So I'm not, what am I trying to say? Not trained as a professor, right? I just started doing it. And so I'm not familiar with sort of the pedagogy and the methodologies that are used, but I'll say, I think to do a good job, we really have to open space. The analogy I use for digital transformation and transformation is the gardener versus the chess master. Pre-transformation, the approach at work was you want to be a chess master, and you want to know how the pieces move, and then you want to have these people do this and do that and move there and capture the other king and sort of this big brain running the show. But that's not how you get value, out of that scenario. The analogy I like to use is a gardener, where your job is to create space and protect from pull weeds, protect from deer. Understand that some days it's going to be a drought and some days you're going to get a flood, and work with that every morning. And every morning is going to be different, and go where the class or the team sort of wants to go naturally. So creating space is the most important thing, creating and holding space. And so I do that again in little ways, like even at work, the check-in round. My brother's teaching at USC, and so I gave him some of these tips for how to teach a remote class. The check-in round is huge. Hear from your students, give them a chance to talk about whatever, get to know them. Working in shared documents is big, so everybody can contribute. It's easy to check out in class. I see my kids doing it, and I know I did it when I was a student. But as teachers, I think we can create an environment where it's not possible to check out. You're engaged the whole time using this technology, by putting up notes and having the notes on a different screen, maybe something like that. I don't know. It was hard. Teaching was much harder than anything else I did, because I just felt this incredible responsibility to understand something and then convey it to kids who were at all different levels of different places in life and different backgrounds. It's really hard, and I had tremendous respect. My parents were both teachers. My grandmother was a teacher, so I have a lot of respect for the profession. And it's hard, but I guess I keep coming back to creating and holding space is the job. It's the job of the professor. It's also the job of the leader at work, and protecting that space and encouraging growth in that space. And there are techniques and tools that you can use to do that.
Great, thanks, Jeff.
We have one final question from Stephen. Please go ahead.
Thanks there. Really appreciate the conversation. Really enjoyed it so far. My question is, do you believe that digital transformation is here to stay, and that it will survive the potential departure of, its biggest advocates like Will Roper, or is it heavily dependent on a couple of, key personalities at pushing it onto a reluctant bureaucracy, a reluctant industrial base, and then once those individuals depart, either with a change of administration or whatnot, that things will kind of just return to the way they've always been done?
So I'll give you two answers to that. One is it's definitely here to stay. There's no going back. Just like in the 70s and 80s, we went from working as aircraft designers on vellum, crawling all over the floor with markers to CAD systems. There's no going back. The productivity value is just too great. So it is here to stay. The other sort of opposite answer I'll give you is what it is will change. Because when you hold any construct for a while, over time, it loses value as a construct. You build up a language around it, and you build up a set of tools around it, and then inevitably it becomes too heavy and not useful. So, if you go back, I've been in the aerospace and defense industry for 30 years, as I said. There was a period where network-centric warfare was the big thing. It was about connecting platforms and so forth. And everything was around, that became the buzzword. And then the administration changes and there's a new buzzword. And now the buzzword sounds pejorative. I don't mean it to. I just mean, and it's good to have a rubric and to have a construct around which collect ideas. But just like, again, I learned at Case when I was doing vector transformations, every so often, if you rotate the axes, the XYZ axes, you'll see things you didn't see before. That happens in math, right? So I don't think I don't think in 10 years people will be using the term digital transformation. I think it'll go away. But that doesn't mean the technologies will go away or will go back. It'll just mean we'll find new operating frameworks. I think Agile was like this, Agile sort of, I don't know, was it the 80s or 90s? I think it was. The Agile Manifesto was written. And then that sort of grew up and was incredibly useful. And a lot of great stuff came out of it. And then it got very heavy. And if you've been involved with Agile since then, there's a lot of contractors that will sell you tens of millions of dollars worth of services to put Agile processes in place, which are every bit as heavy as the ones they replace. So, that is now being replaced by something else. So yes and no. There's no going back. These digital technologies, the AI and all the related technologies will continue to grow. The productivity gains are too great. The opportunity space is too rich. So it's going to keep going forward, but that doesn't mean the name won't change or sort of the current portfolio of what we call digital transformation won't change, in the next 5 or 10 years.
Well, with that, we're actually at the end of the event, and I just wanted to take some time and thank you so much for answering some of our questions, giving us advice, and just for a really good discussion. With that, I would like to turn it over to Professor Goldberg.
Thank you.
Great. Himika, awesome job. Actually, Jeff, I was just texting Himika in the chat. She's graduating from our program this fall and has a job at Deloitte and has a little bit of time. I was like, you should ask Jeff what you should do with your year. It's actually always great seeing students like Himika kind of step up and moderate these sessions. And it's, we're always encouraging them. I mean, this sort of the power of the network. And, I really appreciate Al reconnecting you back with the university. And, it's nice. I see couple current students, and it's nice to have such an interesting mix of people sort of join us for the conversation. And we do hope to welcome you back to campus at some point, at least. And I guess your boys, you said your kids are at Miami-Ville High. Are they down at Oxford, or are they doing remote?
They're upstairs in my house right now, so no, they're not. They're doing remote.
Strange year. Well, we'll look forward to welcoming you back on campus soon. And this is a great conversation. It flew by and covered a lot of great topics.